Hello, my name is Matthew Jefferson, and in this session, I'm going to talk about future developments and challenges for improving high-resolution site characterization. And the primary pieces that we're going to be focusing upon for this session is going to be the conceptual site model and proving out some of the newer technologies for your sites. So we'll be looking at a couple of different tools for improving high-resolution site characterization. And two come to mind for groundwater. One is called 3D visualization and analysis. Another tool is called environmental sequence stratigraphy. And we'll define both of those and talk a little bit about both their strengths and limitations for groundwater. Also, we'll talk a little bit about demonstration of methods of applicability, also known as pilot studies or treatability studies. When they're used, what type of application, and we'll go over a specific case study where that has been used on a project. There are a number of different tools that are available for visualizing and evaluating subsurface data in a two-dimensional and a three-dimensional space. And traditionally speaking, for hazardous waste sites, groundwater plumes, plume maps like the ones that you see on the left figure there are typically used. So our data table, a number of different GIS packages also provide that ability for teams to analyze data that comes in from the field. The one on the right-hand side is a 3D visualization. And that visualization, especially when paired up with a high-resolution site characterization technique, does prove a really powerful point in looking at plume or subsurface features over a three-dimensional space and being able to do some analysis and thinking about where those concentrations are and what are the driving forces in terms of the flux and the flow patterns that are in there. Now, if you have a large series of data over a period of time, you have more power with that, and you get this sort of four-dimensional case where you can look at how that plume moves, how it's evolved over a period of time, and be able to do that in a series of pictures and string them together in some of these visualization packages. So some of the earlier presentations covered the application or the different types of uses or software packages associated with 3D visualization and analysis. I'm going to cover the process here, or the process that we typically use here at EPA. So it follows this general process, and so the first and foremost is actually clarifying the project goals. And it sounds like a very simplistic piece, but it's also important to remember what specific questions are trying to be answered for the visualization so that it can be tailored to give the images that both the project team needs and have specific goals in mind for the analysis portion of this. The second piece of this is managing the data, and that's being able to address acquiring, reviewing, processing, and importing that data. And knowing that some of these projects span over a really long period of time, this can be quite challenging. Not all the information is all digital. Sometimes it has to be converted from old paper files, and that can be quite challenging in itself. Being able to find those files, it can be also somewhat difficult. So the third part of this is developing components and databases for visualizations. And we'll talk a little bit about the main components of 3D visualization and analysis, which include both the geologic, hydrogeologic, and chemical data. And you'll see how they all interact. That really paints a good story for the conceptual site model. The next step is to develop an integrated visualization, and that's integrating the various components with calibrations and outlier checks. And there's a number of different statistical packages that sort of come into this that are able to sort of understand what the relationship is between all those particular components. The real power, I think, really is in this next step here, which is the analysis of visualization. And that's assessing what the 3D visualization depicts. And so using the power of those three components, both the geologic, hydrogeologic, and chemical information, we can often be able to tell a lot of information about what is going on with the conceptual site model, what the modes and media and transport that's going on, where are the key areas that we should be focusing upon, what's sort of the remedial time frame for considering different types of designs that are out there, what's the relationship between geologic and hydrogeologic and the chemical factors that are being depicted. And then lastly, we present those conclusions and recommendations that are associated with the analyzation of the visualization itself and provide recommendations for next steps. So here are some examples of different types of geologic, hydrogeologic, and chemical contaminant components that are oftentimes used in 3D visualizations. Things such as geologic map data, boring logs, lithologic information, well construction data, index of hydrologic conductivity, chemical contaminants, sampling periods, sampling method, analytical methods. If you use high-resolution site characterization and using direct push, that information can also be included in here. But I would also argue that what's just as important is the coordinates associated with this. And so understanding exactly where those boring locations happened, the lithologic index locations, the monitoring well locations, and any type of sampling and the dates that they were done. So that the visualization or whoever is doing this can pull that information together and be able to analyze all that information into a single package or single image. Also, another feature for many of the software packages include other types of data that would help analyze. So you can not only use your site-based maps, but you can use historical maps, topographic maps, any maps that describe different types of infrastructure. Maps including geopolitical boundaries can also be integrated to give more power to understanding what exactly the site conditions are and how the conceptual site model meets different types of needs. So one of the limitations to 3D visualization, as with many tools, is being able to interpolate between known data points. And so that can be really challenging for doing analysis on very specific areas, smaller areas, understanding the flow regime, or getting an understanding of what the geologic units are in a particular area. And so what can be helpful to clarify that is using a technique called environmental sequence stratigraphy. And what environmental sequence stratigraphy does is it looks at different types of depositional units based on grain size. And I should note that this is a specific type of analysis in the geologic field. That, like I mentioned before, this can help isolate what specific areas to focus upon when thinking about your design of a remedy. And this helps clarify what the flow regimes ultimately look like. EPA's Groundwater Forum produced a paper on this, on stepwise methodology to be able to walk through how this environmental sequence stratigraphy is done in a hazardous waste site. So here's an example of how we used environmental sequence stratigraphy on a hazardous waste site. This site was located on a delta, and a number of different channel bar sands were underneath this particular area where there was a release of chlorinated solvents. And what the project team was ultimately tasked to do was to figure out where exactly to target its in situ chemical remedy. And so that requires a significant amount of knowledge of what's going on with the subsurface, what the flow regimes ultimately look like in a very complicated geologic environment. And so the folks who helped put this together developed these fence diagrams to give a better idea of exactly how to design and where those injections should be for the remedy. So finally, the last improvement to high-resolution site characterization is the demonstrations of method applicability, or DMA. And the goal is to establish that a proposed technology and strategy can provide information that's appropriate to meet the project decision criteria, and whether that criteria is to do further investigation, to make a decision that's out there, or to meet some sort of project needs, is be able to say that that technology or that method can be used on a large scale. So some of those site-specific performance evaluations that we would consider might be different types of analytical and direct sensing methods, different types of drilling methods that we maybe consider. It could be a sample design or different sample collection techniques or sample preparation strategies. And so we want to use all these and see if they work in particular for the site and specific chemical contaminants that may be existing at the site. So these are oftentimes used to select information sources, either for the field or can be used off-site. What's involved with the demonstrations method of applicability? And oftentimes is performed very early in the program, whether it's a characterization or a design and construction. It can be done prior to the main mobilization, or it can be as an add-on early, like weeks ahead of time, before the main mobilization comes in. And it goes beyond a simple technology evaluation to optimize the full scale of that particular technology or design in itself. So that might be looking at the sample design, decisions, unit designations that are out there. You can look at different types of logistics, including sample preparation and throughput. You can also look at the data management issues and contingencies that are associated with your quality assurance plan. So there's several different performance considerations for demonstrations of method applicability. And one is effectiveness. Did it work as advertised? Did it achieve the goals that we anticipated? And there's a number of different quality assurance, quality control issues that must be considered. What is the expected variability with a new process? How did it affect precision? Is there any bias, and how did it affect the false positives and false negatives? Did we meet the false positives and false negatives associated with the quality control that was defined under the quality control program? How does the sample processing affect the results? And have the initial relationships of the collaborative data sets that have been developed to provide the framework for the preliminary quality control program. Another thing to consider is the matrix issues. Are there any issues associated with it? Do we have collaborative data sets, and do they lead to the same decision? In other words, if we're using multiple data sets, do we get the same information associated with it that gives us the same decision logic? And have there been alternative strategies that have been assessed as contingencies if one of those particular data sets don't work out or the technology is misleading? So I'd like to present a case study for using demonstrations of method applicability. And the question that was posed to my team by the site or the project team was they wanted to find better methods to being able to quickly assess a mining site with mercury contamination. And at the time, the project team was using Lumex along with sending samples back to the lab. And the Lumex, unfortunately, was not getting to the concentrations that they needed. It was being able to detect whether or not there was presence of mercury that exists out there. but unfortunately, it wasn't very accurate for their decision-making purposes. The other challenge of it was that the lab processing and analysis was very, very expensive for the team, and so they can only send a number of different samples before running into funding and resource constraints. One of the ideas that we wanted to test out here was using the XRF, and we started off looking at different literature for uses of XRF on mercury. We didn't find too many that were out there, so we set forth to do a field demonstration to be able to collect samples and to see whether or not the XRF could be able to match the laboratory results. So we took several different shots of in situ shots using the XRF, and then took those samples back to the lab, looked over a large concentration range that sort of was huddled around the action limits for the project itself, and then for each of the steps that involved the processing, whether it was the sieving, or whether it was the handling or the drying of the samples, or shooting the samples with the XRF, we wanted to make sure that the concentrations of mercury didn't change within the soil matrix itself. And what we did find was we had excellent correlation between both the XRF and the field lab results. And so it did give the team another tool that they could use to quickly assess and meet the needs of their quality assurance plan.